YouTubers, thrill seekers, small gerbils, and people named Bob. Greetings and hello. It is I, your favorite obscure social studies teacher, with just enough expertise to make things interesting, Mr. Palumbo, and this is the Professor Liberty Podcast. Hello, folks. Welcome to the show. I know it's been a while. For those of you out there waiting with bated breath, the tens and tens of you across the fruited plains, and even a few sprinkled across the oceans beyond, I apologize. According to ChatGPT, I had laryngitis, and you can probably still tell it in my voice. So I've been having some vocal cord issues, but I'm going to really grind it through here, folks, because I know I haven't done a podcast in a while. If you enjoy the show, please don't hesitate to share it with your friends, your family, your coworkers. Maybe it's your dad, maybe it's your mom. They're watching too much Fox News. They're watching too much CNN, and they can't get out of the propaganda machine. If you'd like to email the show, the email is professorliberty1776@gmail.com. That's professorliberty1776@gmail.com. Send me your questions, your comments, your queries, your concerns, your quagmires. Any other cues? I think I'm done. Well, a lot's been going on over there, folks. Lots been going on in the world. If you haven't been paying attention, we are at war. And it's been, well, the war's been over, and then it's been back on, and the ceasefire is over, and then it's been back on, and then it's over, and then it's back on. I don't know what number we are here. And then we're talking about ending civilizations. Did you guys catch that one? And we talked about blowing up power plants and innocent people. And as I'm watching this cycle play out over and over again, I couldn't help but think of the limits of military power itself. Not just, who has the force or who has the better technology or the better reach. Clearly, that's the United States. But there seems to be a point which military power stops producing clear outcomes. You can project force, you can shape events, you can reshape entire regions. But sometimes, even with that power, you can't achieve the objectives that you want. So this might be another abstract episode, ladies and gentlemen, but it is my podcast. Today I want to talk about the concept of total war. And I'm going to present a question throughout the podcast today. Have we reached a limit of this concept of total war? So let's dig into it. You know, there was a time when war had limits. In the 17th and 18th century, conflict was defined by a shared code. We called it the Gentleman's War. In the Gentleman's War, there was still war. There was still death, a lot of dying, a lot of terrible carnage. But it was a war restrained by both parties on purpose. It was a war with clear rules. Officers were from the aristocracy, from both sides. And this gave a culture of honor amidst the violence. Prisoners were treated according to their rank rather than anonymous enemies. Ransoms and exchange were standard practice. You know, the story of George Washington returning General Howe's dog makes the most sense in this context. In 1777, after the American victory at the Battle of Germantown, American soldiers found a lost dog wandering in the battlefield. And they realized that it belonged to General Howe. Instead of keeping the dog or ignoring it or shooting it, Washington ordered that the dog be cleaned up and safely returned to General Howe. Now, there's no written record of this story. It could be an anecdote, could be a legend, but the story highlights a vital assumption of the era. There was boundaries to war. It was a brutal business, but it was conducted by recognizable opponents, and it wasn't a all-consuming force that dissolved into every aspect of life. For centuries, war was almost ritualized. Armies faced each other in formations. They had clear delineating uniforms. Commands would be given, shots would be fired, and you would go around and around and around. Civilians, for the most part, were outside of this war. You see, back in the old days, war belonged to the kings. And because it belonged to the kings, it had boundaries. Think of it this way. When war was seen as the king's business, like a dispute over property, it's about a border, a throne, or a tax. Because the king wants to inherit that land, he has no interest in burning it to the ground. He needs the farmers alive to pay him tribute, and he needs the cities intact to fuel his treasury and his economy. But that system depended on distance between the state and the people. And once that distance collapsed, war began to change. Now, I want to talk about two elements that transformed this old warfare into something that we call now total war. The first major force that caused this evolution was nationalism. Nationalism, and I'm just going to quickly define it here. Nationalism is intense pride in your country, your people, but it has a small tinge of superiority. Okay, so patriotism is, and I've talked about this probably like way, way back in the day. Patriotism is you're proud of your country, you're proud to be an American, yay, go America, red, white, and blue. Nationalism, and I always say this in class, it doesn't have to go this way. It's on a spectrum, but nationalism is, yay, I love my country's the best, and we are superior in all ways to other people. And you can see how that can start to go in different directions, some of which might have unintended consequences. As nationalism grew, especially during the Napoleonic era, soldiers were no longer just professionals or mercenaries. They were citizens fighting for something that they believed in. Things like the homeland, or in French, the parté. So now it's no longer just geographical. It's also personal. It has an identity. This shift also changed participation itself. Like I said earlier, war wasn't just confined to the soldiers. Now the entire society became involved. Men fighting, women producing, children supporting in logistics, the elderly sustaining morale. And once everyone contributes to the war in some way, this boundary between who's a civilian and who's a combatant begins to erode. The second element to the evolution of total war is industrialization. And this is interesting that I'm talking about this again because I feel like for the past year, most of the podcast episodes have something to do with industrialization or technology. When we did the future of work, or when we did World War I and how it shattered Christianity in Western Europe. And it was something that Western Europe has never recovered from, right? I just find that interesting that this topic keeps coming up. So here we are again with industrialization, right? The rise of industry, railroads. These things made war faster, larger, more interconnected. And I like to talk about in class, you'll first hear about total war in my class when we get to the American Civil War. There's a lot of dichotomies with the American Civil War, right? Confederacy versus Union, North versus South, slave versus free. The one I'm talking about is different systems for society. One was industrial, one was agrarian. As the war dragged on, Abraham Lincoln increasingly understood that defeating the Confederacy required more than just battlefield victories. And if you know your Civil War history, The Union got their butt kicked the first few years of the war anyway. So very soon, this idea came that soldiers can be replaced. We have to destroy the very system itself. And no figure embodies this shift more clearly than General William Tecumseh Sherman. As General Sherman looked across the smoke rising from the American South, he concluded that the war was no longer just army against army. He saw that the soldier in the trench was only as strong as the farmer who fed him and the rail line that moved him. As he famously put it, quote, "We are not only fighting a hostile army, but a hostile people," unquote. So during Sherman's infamous March to the Sea, Union forces moved through Georgia not to occupy territory, but to dismantle the Confederacy's ability to function. Total war. Railroads were destroyed. They were twisted into things called Sherman neckties. Telegraph lines were cut. Crops were burned. Livestock seized or destroyed. The goal was not to obtain a victory on the battlefield. The goal was to achieve systematic collapse. For the first time in recent history, maybe we could go back to the Assyrians. Maybe they functioned in some kind of a total war. But for centuries before this, like I said, there was war with rules, at least in Western Europe. For the first time, total war, infrastructure, agriculture, civilian life, cities, women, children, everybody was a possible target. And this doesn't get talked about very much, but because of campaigns like Sherman's March to the Sea, the South was economically devastated for decades. Even going into the early to mid 20th century, the South was still economically behind the North and was still backwards in many ways. And some of that is because of the absolute destruction of the infrastructure. All right, the evolution of total war continues into World War I. And since I just had a podcast on that a few podcasts ago, I won't go into this too much. But World War I is not going to start as a total war. European powers still think it's going to be a few isolated, decisive battles. It'll be over before a couple weeks. And you know what's funny? Can we talk about, I just thought of this. This is not in the podcast notes. History repeating itself. American Civil War. Oh, it'll be over in a few weeks, few months. World War I. Oh, it'll be over in a few weeks, a few months. Vietnam. It'll be over in a few weeks, a few months. Iraq. It'll be over in a few weeks, a few months, 14 years later. And what's Trump saying today with Iran? Oh, it's going to be a couple weeks, 60 days later, still going. Probably going to escalate. But anyway, why do we study history, folks? So we know World War I eventually became a war of attrition. Industrialization did not just expand the warfighting capabilities, it transformed killing and sent casualties into the stratosphere. Railroads, just like in the American Civil War, railroads fed endless reinforcements to the front. Factories produced shells and bombs at staggering rates. Machine guns, barbed wire, planes, tanks, gas. World War I showed that in the modern era, war stopped being a series of battles, of isolated events. Oh, and it's wintertime, so let's take a break. No, there's none of that. It's year-round, nonstop. It became a relentless grinding process. And I like to point out to the class, if I remember it, sometimes I don't, but even if you look at aerial combat with the plane, by the beginning of the war, the plane is just like surveillance, and they've got blimps, and then they get into dogfighting very quickly after that. And by the end of the war, did you know they were already doing bombing raids in cities, right? A harbinger to things to come. And if World War I revealed the industrialization of war, by World War II, we have reached our full fruition. By the time we get to World War II, the distinction between the battlefield and society had completely collapsed. Entire nations were mobilized, not just for military campaigns, but for sustained industrial output. And I want to camp on this for a little bit. Nowhere does this show more clearly than towards the end of the war and the bombing campaign, the firebombing of Tokyo, the laying of waste of Japan through aerial bombing by the United States. They were running out of targets. They have nothing else to bomb. And yet, Japan would not surrender. And I want you to think about that. I want you to think about that when they go back to Iran and they start blowing up schools again, and bridges, and power plants, and refineries, right? Because of this concept of total war. Is Iran going to surrender? And Tokyo is huge, guys. Go look at a map of Tokyo. Tokyo is one of the biggest cities in the world. Now, I don't know in 1945 how big it was, but because Japan is so mountainous and there's not a lot of space, I'm pretty sure Tokyo was still pretty big in 1945. You can Google that. We laid waste to Tokyo. Firebombing, right? What's a firebomb? An incendiary device. It burns everything. You want to talk about hell on earth. How many people died? How many Japanese people died? Vast sections of Tokyo were erased. And yet, after months of firebombing, cities destroyed, industrial capacity completely gutted, Japan did not surrender. If total war is defined by the ability to break an enemy through the destruction of its capacity to resist, then we've reached a problem, boys and girls, because we've done that. And surrender has not come. So what happens when you destroy everything, but it does not produce a surrender? At what point does escalation stop guaranteeing results? And I want to pause here. This is exactly where I think we are with the Iran conflict. We're exactly right there. I think if they go back in, if the United States goes back in, starts laying waste to Iran, I don't think they're going to get the results that they're looking for. And unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, innocent people are going to suffer. Now, we know what they did in August of 1945, what the United States did to fix this problem. They dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan, and finally Japan agreed to an unconditional surrender. The last unconditional surrender the United States has ever been able to secure, by the way. So think about all the wars we fought, and that was the last time we achieved an unconditional surrender, and it took 2 atomic bombs. So my point to you guys out there, the 5 of you listening, 1945 shows us that total war had reached its logical endpoint. Not because destruction could no longer increase, that's not the case, but the increase no longer guarantees victory. The question was no longer just what could be destroyed, but how much destruction was required to break a nation's will. You guys, think about Vietnam. Think about Operation Linebacker, Operation Linebacker 2. I don't have the numbers in front of me. How many bombs were dropped in Vietnam? We didn't win that one either. In fact, after World War II, we went straight into the Cold War era because we reached this zenith of military technological destruction, right? MAD, mutually assured destruction. So total war, you guys, died a long time ago. And then we went into 40 years of Cold War. Then it became about proxy conflict, economic pressure, ideological struggle, right? Instead of conventional combat. And at what point, ladies and gentlemen, at what point, if you go blow up power plants, if you go blow up bridges, if you go blow up hydraulic dams, and roads. And if you're literally destroying the civilization, as President Trump tweeted out, at what point does that not become war, but becomes war crimes? You know, Curtis LeMay, the Air Force general who was in charge of firebombing Tokyo, is quoted as saying, "Good thing we won that war, because if we didn't, we would be executed as war criminals." Now, why is he saying that, ladies and gentlemen? Well, here's a figure for you. During the firebombing of Tokyo, the estimated casualties, and you know casualties is dead and wounded, 80,000 to 100,000 people, mostly civilians. This kind of campaign clearly blurred the lines of what was at that time a social norm in regards to war ethics. There wasn't a fully developed, universally enforced law governing aerial combat. But there were some principles. According to the Hague Convention, there were some principles. For one, distinguishing between civilian and military targets, avoiding unnecessary suffering, limiting the destruction of what is not militarily necessary. And clearly the firebombing of Tokyo violated each one of those principles. And I ask you guys out there, is blowing up power plants and bridges in Iran violating these principles as well? Today in the 21st century, war is no longer stops and starts. Your team versus my team. You guys can go look at the footage. I don't like to look at it, but what's going on with drone warfare in Ukraine, where these singular drones are hunting down individual soldiers, right? Things have changed. You don't have to have a uniform anymore. There's no more boundaries. There's no more rules. There's no more officers that are gentlemen. In our modern world, war moves through AI networks and satellites, and it uses economies and entire infrastructures. And you can't just go blow all that stuff up, especially if there's not an imminent threat to your country, for the sake of total warfare and trying to get your enemy to commit to an unconditional surrender. In other words, making them cry uncle. And you guys, we are on a weird trajectory here. Okay, World War II, we were attacked by Japan. Vietnam, there was a weird torpedo boat thing that got us the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which was a blank check for President Johnson to do his silly little war. Iraq never attacked us. Afghanistan was the base of operations for terrorists, and we went in and blown everything up over there, which there wasn't much. Here's my point, guys. We're just going into places, blowing them up. We're not even being attacked anymore, right? The war machine. Remember last episode? The war machine does whatever the war machine wants to do. This isn't a Republican issue. This isn't a Democrat issue. This isn't a liberal issue. This isn't a conservative issue. This is an everyone issue. And I don't care who's in charge. We have to hold these people to account who hold immense power and responsibility. They can blow civilians up with a twist of the finger. With the end or the limit of total power, that doesn't mean war is over. That just means war has to change. And we have to go back to economic pressures, building coalitions, international pressures. You know, the gunboat diplomacy of Theodore Roosevelt isn't going to work in the 21st century. Here at Professor Liberty, we seek to educate, inspire, and restore. If you like this podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts and give me a 5-star rating. Check us out on teacherspayteachers.com if you'd like to buy lessons and activities. If you like what you hear on the podcast, you'll find stuff on teacherspayteachers.com, things I've made for your classroom, your homeschool needs. Also, check out ProfessorLiberty.com and sign up for the Proclaiming Liberty blog, where I also, from time to time, write down essays and thoughts and podcast notes that don't make the show. Until next time, go throughout the land and proclaim liberty.